People think home ownership is the American dream. They're wrong. It's a hostage situation, and your captors are bored suburbanites armed with clipboards and measuring tape. I spent 10 years saving for a quiet backyard pool, my one slice of peace in a loud world. Then Veronica decided it violated an HOA bylaw from 1994. She wanted my sanctuary filled with dirt. She thought she held all the cards. She didn't realize the empty, unzoned plot of land directly behind her pristine patio was up for sale. There is a very specific kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones when you spend 50 hours a week managing logistics for a mid-sized freight company. It's not just physical. It's a dull, gray static in your brain, a constant ringing of missed deadlines, delayed shipments, and angry vendors. For me, the cure to that static wasn't whiskey or golf. It was water. I bought the house on Larkspur Lane for 2 reasons. First, the mortgage was exactly $30 less than my monthly rent had been. Second, the backyard faced a dense line of mature oak trees instead of another row of vinyl siding. It was a modest 3-bedroom ranch, built in the early 2000s, nestled in a sprawling subdivision called Oak Ridge Estates. The neighborhood had curved sidewalks, identical mailboxes, and an ironclad homeowners association. I didn't care about the rules at the time. I just wanted the yard. It took me 4 years of skipped vacations, packed lunches, and overtime shifts to save the money for the pool. I didn't want a massive resort-style grotto with waterfalls and a swim-up bar. I just wanted a simple, rectangular, fiberglass shell. Plunge depth, a good filter, a concrete deck barely wide enough for a single lounge chair. When the contractors finally packed up their trucks and the hose stopped running, I stood on the edge of the coping and stared at the water. It was crystal clear, glowing a faint, synthetic blue under the afternoon sun. The hum of the variable speed pump was a low, steady thrum. White noise, a mechanical heartbeat that drowned out the freight trucks and the ringing phones. I stripped down to my trunks, sat on the edge, and let my feet slip into the freezing water. The shock of the cold was electric. I closed my eyes, leaned back on my hands, and took my first real breath in half a decade. "You didn't submit the final grading plans?" The voice didn't just break the silence, it shattered it. I snapped my eyes open. Standing on the other side of my 4-foot chain-link fence was a woman. She was in her late 50s, wearing a crisp white tennis skirt and a navy blue polo shirt, despite the fact that our neighborhood didn't have a tennis court. Her blonde hair was sprayed into a rigid, motionless helmet. She was holding a tablet encased in a thick, black OtterBox. I blinked, momentarily disoriented. "Excuse me." "The grading plans," she repeated. Her voice was entirely devoid of warmth. It sounded like a dial tone. "For the excavation, you submitted the initial architectural request, which was conditionally approved. You did not submit the post-dig grading schematics to the Environmental Committee." I pulled my legs out of the water, the cold air suddenly biting at my wet skin. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" She didn't introduce herself with a name. She introduced herself with a title. "I am the president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, Veronica." I had lived in the house for 4 years. I had never met Veronica. I mailed my quarterly dues to a P.O. box. I threw the monthly newsletters in the recycling bin. I kept my grass cut to exactly 2.5 inches. I didn't cause trouble. I didn't exist to these people. Until today. "The contractor handled all the permits," I said, grabbing a towel from the chair and wrapping it around my waist. "Oh," I walked toward the fence, leaving a trail of wet footprints on my brand new concrete. "The city inspector signed off on the final dig yesterday morning. It's all filed." "The city is not the association," Veronica said. She didn't look at my face. She was staring past me, her eyes scanning the pool, the deck, the filter equipment, cataloging every inch of my sanctuary. "The city doesn't care about community standards. We do. Your contractor's heavy machinery rutted the utility easement, and that pump housing isn't concealed by approved vegetation." I stared at her. She wasn't angry. That was the terrifying part. If she had been yelling, I could have yelled back. But she was entirely calm. She was a woman who had found her power in a world of microscopic infractions, and she wore that power like a loaded weapon. "It's a standard pool pump," I said, trying to keep my voice even. It's 3 feet tall, and I literally just filled the pool an hour ago. I haven't even had time to buy bushes yet. Veronica tapped her lacquered fingernail against the screen of her tablet. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was sharp, like a beak against glass. Bushes must be a minimum of 36 inches at the time of planting. Deciduous or evergreen, but no invasive species. Check page 42 of your covenant, she said. She finally looked at me. Her eyes were pale, washed-out blue, framed by expensive polarized sunglasses. You have 14 days to submit the grading paperwork and conceal the machinery. After that, it's a $50 fine. Per day. She didn't wait for a response. She turned on her heel and walked away, her bright white tennis shoes silent on the grass. I stood by the fence for a long time. The hum of the pool pump was still there, but it didn't sound like white noise anymore. It sounded like a ticking clock. The gray static was back in my head. My sanctuary had been breached, and looking back, I realized now that this wasn't a warning. It was a declaration of war. The first letter arrived exactly 15 days later. It was taped to my front door, not placed in the mailbox that would be a federal offense, taped directly to the glass of my storm door, sealed in a heavy cream-colored envelope. I saw it as I pulled into the driveway after a brutal 12-hour shift. My stomach dropped. I knew what it was before I even parked the car. I ripped it off the door, tearing the tape. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed on official HOA letterhead. Notice of violation, infraction, failure to conceal mechanical equipment. Fine assessed, $50,000. I crumpled the paper in my fist. I had planted the bushes. I had spent my entire Sunday at the home improvement store loading 4 massive, prickly holly bushes into the back of my sedan, scratching the hell out of my bumper in the process. I dug the holes myself. I planted them in a neat row right in front of the pool filter. I walked straight through the house, out the back door, and marched over to the equipment pad. The bushes were there. They were green. They were undeniably bushes. I grabbed a tape measure from the garage and extended it next to the tallest branch. 34 inches. I had bought bushes that were 2 inches too short. I stood in the fading evening light, gripping the metal tape measure so hard the edges dug into my palm. A normal person wouldn't notice 2 inches. A normal person wouldn't care. But Veronica had clearly walked onto my property while I was at work, carrying her own tape measure, and documented the discrepancy. I paid the $50. I went back to the nursery, bought 4 new bushes that were a verified 40 inches tall, dug up the old ones, and planted the new ones. I took a time-stamped photo, with the tape measure clearly visible, and emailed it to the HOA board. I thought that would be the end of it. I was an idiot. When you capitulate to a tyrant, you don't buy peace. You just prove that you can be broken. Over the next 3 months, my home turned into a battlefield, and I was losing every skirmish. The envelopes became a weekly occurrence. Notice of violation. Trash receptacle visible from the street. I had brought the can in at 6:01 p.m. instead of 5:04 p.m. because of a traffic jam on the interstate. Fine, $25. Notice of violation. Unauthorized outdoor furniture. I had left a single folded beach towel draped over the back of my patio chair overnight to dry. Fine, $25. Notice of violation. Excessive noise pollution. I ran the pool vacuum at 11 a.m. on a Saturday. Veronica claimed the motor exceeded the 60 decibel limit outlined in the noise ordinance. She included a screenshot from an app on her phone as proof. Fine, $100. I stopped using the pool. The very thing I had built to escape my stress had become the epicenter of it. Every time I stepped out my back door, my eyes darted to the fence line, looking for a white tennis skirt or a tablet. I felt hunted on my own property. I couldn't relax in the water, knowing that at any moment, Veronica could be standing there, cataloging my existence for flaws. The neighborhood noticed. You can't keep a targeted campaign like this a secret in a subdivision where houses sit 20 feet apart. One evening, I caught my next-door neighbor, Dave, pulling weeds in his front bed. Dave was a quiet, retired mechanic who mostly kept to himself. When I walked over to the property line to say hello, he physically flinched. "Hey, Tristan," he muttered, keeping his eyes on the mulch. "Hey, Dave, look, I wanted to ask you, Has Veronica been coming around your place, sending letters? Dave vigorously shook his head, pulling a dandelion out by its roots. No. No, I keep my head down. I suggest you do the same. I am keeping my head down, I said, a bitter edge creeping into my voice. I planted the bushes. I paid the fines. She's measuring my trash cans, Dave. Dave finally looked up. His eyes were sympathetic, but mostly they were scared. You didn't ask permission, Tristan. You got the pool approved by the architectural committee, sure, but you didn't go kiss the ring. Veronica doesn't like surprises. She doesn't like things happening in this neighborhood that she didn't personally orchestrate. You bypassed her. Now she's making an example out of you. So what do? I asked. You survive her, Dave said quietly, or you move. I walked back into my house, locked the door, and stared at the stack of cream-colored envelopes sitting on my kitchen counter. They totaled over $400 in fines. It wasn't the money that was breaking me. It was the absolute suffocating helplessness. I owned this house. I paid the mortgage, but it wasn't mine. I was just renting space in Veronica's personal kingdom. I poured myself a glass of tap water, walked to the back window, and looked out at the dark, silent pool. A thin layer of leaves floated on the surface. The water looked black. I didn't want to move. I couldn't afford to move. But I also knew I couldn't live like this, jumping at shadows, terrified of my own mailbox. I decided right then that I was going to fight back. I was going to read their precious rulebook cover to cover. I would learn their laws. I would abide by them perfectly, and I would make myself untouchable. I didn't realize that the rulebook wasn't designed to protect the homeowners. It was designed to execute them. The Oak Ridge Estates Community Center smelled permanently of stale coffee and industrial floor wax. It was a bleak, cinder-block building with fluorescent tube lighting that hummed aggressively, casting a sickly green pallor over everyone inside. The HOA board met on the second Tuesday of every month at 7 p.m. I walked through the double-glass doors at 6:55. There were about 20 folding chairs set up in the center of the linoleum floor. Half of them were empty. The people who were there sat slouched, looking defeated, the usual mix of residents contesting minor fines or begging for permission to paint their front doors a shade of beige that wasn't strictly on the pre-approved color wheel. At the front of the room, seated behind a long plastic folding table, was the board. 3 people, a bored-looking guy in a suit who was aggressively checking his phone, an elderly woman knitting a scarf, and sitting dead center like a presiding judge was Veronica. She wore a gray blazer tonight, professional, serious. She had a thick, leather-bound binder resting on the table in front of her. I sat in the second row, clutching a manila folder filled with receipts, photos, and printed emails. I had paid all the fines, every single one. I was here to formally request that the harassment stop, to state for the record that my property was in full compliance. I was going to be rational. I was going to be calm. Veronica called the meeting to order with a sharp crack of a wooden gavel she had actually brought from home. The sound echoed off the cinder-block walls. They moved through the agenda with ruthless efficiency. The man in the suit denied a request for a wooden playset because the wood stain was too rustic. The elderly woman denied a variance for a widened driveway. Veronica didn't even speak. She just nodded her approval as dreams and bank accounts were quietly crushed. Item 7, the man in the suit said, checking his phone again. Property at 42 Larkspur Lane, Tristan Pendleton. Status of backyard landscaping compliance. I stood up. I didn't wait to be called on. I walked to the front, stopping a few feet from the folding table. Everything is in compliance, I said, my voice projecting louder than I intended. I opened my folder and laid the photographs on the table. The pump is concealed by 40-inch evergreens. The noise levels are well within city and HOA ordinances. The yard is graded. The fines are paid. I am here to request that the board cease issuing arbitrary citations. Veronica looked down at the photos. She didn't touch them. She didn't even lean forward. She just looked at them with a mild, bored expression. The fines were not arbitrary, Mr. Pendleton. They were assessed based on established covenants, she said, her voice smooth and practiced. And while it appears you have remedied the superficial issues regarding the landscaping, a much more severe violation has been brought to our attention. My chest tightened. The gray static rushed back into my ears. What are you talking about? Veronica calmly opened her leather binder. She turned past dozens of tabbed sections, her manicured fingers moving with deliberate slowness. She finally stopped on a page that looked yellowed with age. When you submitted your architectural request for the pool, you included a property survey, Veronica said. I decided to review it again yesterday, alongside the original 1998 Oak Ridge Estates charter. She slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a photocopy of my property lines, with the pool drawn in. She had taken a red felt-tip pen and circled a corner of the concrete decking. By law, all permanent structures must be set back a minimum of 15 feet from the rear property line to maintain the drainage easement, Veronica said. She looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw a faint, cold smile touch the corners of her mouth. Your pool decking, the concrete shell itself, extends into that setback by exactly 4.5 inches. I stared at the red circle. My brain struggled to process the words. 4 inches? You're talking about 4 inches of concrete? It's flat on the ground. It doesn't affect drainage. It is a permanent structure, Veronica replied, her voice hardening. It violates the foundational charter of this community. The architectural committee approved your plans conditionally, assuming the final build would adhere to the setback. It did not. The contractor measured from the fence, I argued, my voice rising, the panic finally breaking through my enforced calm. Oh, the fence has been there since the house was built. If the fence is off by 4 inches, that's not my fault. The association is not responsible for the errors of previous builders, Veronica said smoothly. However, we are responsible for enforcing the charter. A non-compliant structure cannot remain on the property. I felt the blood drain from my face. The humming of the lights seemed deafening. What exactly are you saying? Veronica closed the binder. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. I am saying, Mr. Pendleton, that your pool is an illegal structure. You have 60 days to remove the concrete decking from the easement zone. Remove it? I laughed, a harsh, desperate sound. It's a contiguous pour. It's rebar and gunite. I can't just slice off 4 inches of a swimming pool deck. It would compromise the entire structural integrity of the shell. The whole thing would crack. I'd have to rip the entire pool out and fill the hole with dirt. Veronica folded her hands on top of her binder. She looked at me with the serene, untouchable grace of an executioner who had just pulled the lever. Then I suggest you contact a demolition crew in the morning, she said. If the structure is not removed in 60 days, the association will fine you $500 a week. If the fines remain unpaid, we will place a lien on your home, and we will foreclose. The room was dead silent. Even the man in the suit had put down his phone. The other residents stared at the floor, terrified to even breathe, lest Veronica turn her gaze on them. I looked at Veronica. I looked into those pale blue eyes. She didn't care about the drainage. She didn't care about the charter. She cared that I had brought a tape measure to a fight she started. She was going to take my pool, my peace, and my money simply because she had the power to do it. I didn't yell. I didn't flip the table. I just slowly gathered my photographs, put them back in my manila folder, and turned around. I walked down the center aisle, pushed open the heavy glass doors, and walked out into the cool night air. I was beaten. I knew it. A lawyer would cost me thousands, and HOAs have nearly unlimited power in this state. They could take my house. They would take my house. I drove home in silence. I parked in the driveway, walked through the dark house, and stepped out onto the back patio. I looked at the pool. The moonlight reflected off the water, rippling gently in the night breeze. It was beautiful, and it was dead. I sat down on a patio chair and put my head in my hands, letting the exhaustion finally pull me under. I sat there for hours. It wasn't until the sun started to come up, painting the sky in bruised purples and dull oranges, that I lifted my head. I looked past my pool, past my chain-link fence, through the dense line of oak trees that separated my neighborhood from the main road. Through the branches, I saw the back of Veronica's house. She lived on the adjacent cul-de-sac, her property backing up to a large, overgrown tract of undeveloped land that sat just outside the boundaries of Oak Ridge Estates, and staked into the tall, unkempt weeds directly behind Veronica's pristine, perfectly compliant wrought iron fence, bathed in the early morning light, was a wooden sign. For sale. 2.5 acres, unzoned, agricultural. I stared at the sign. A slow, strange feeling began to bloom in my chest. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't panic. It was an idea. A terrible, beautiful, deeply cynical idea. The number on the sign was a local area code. I dialed it from my kitchen table at 8 a.m. A man with a raspy, nicotine-stained voice answered on the third ring. His name was Miller. "The tract behind Oak Ridge?" Miller said, coughing into the receiver. "Yeah, it's still available. Has been for 3 years. It's a dead zone, buddy. 2.5 acres shaped like a wedge. It backs right up to the subdivision's iron fence on one side and kisses County Highway 9 on the other. It's zoned agricultural, but it's too small to farm and too noisy from the highway to build a house on." "How much?" I asked. "Asking 50. I'd take 45. $45,000. I didn't have $45,000 in liquid cash. I had spent my savings on the pool, but I had a 401k I had been paying into since I was 22. I had equity in the house. I had a truck I could downgrade. Normal people don't liquidate their retirement to buy a useless, noisy, wedge-shaped plot of dirt just to ruin an elderly woman's life. But I wasn't normal anymore. Veronica had systematically dismantled my sanity over the course of 3 months, charging me by the inch to do it. The gray static in my head was gone, replaced by a cold, humming clarity. I met Miller at the property at noon. I parked my truck on the shoulder of the county highway and walked through knee-high crabgrass and thistle. The land was flat, sun-baked, and smelled faintly of diesel exhaust from the passing semi-trucks. I walked the perimeter. The closer I got to the back boundary, the quieter the highway noise became, muffled by the sheer density of the weeds. Then I saw it. The Oak Ridge Estates boundary line. A 6-foot-tall black wrought iron fence spanning the entire western edge of the plot, and sitting immediately on the other side of that iron fence, separated by maybe 30 feet of immaculate, chemically treated Bermuda grass, was Veronica's house. It was a McMansion, brick facade, massive Palladian windows, a sprawling travertine patio with a built-in outdoor kitchen. She had a pergola draped with blooming wisteria. It was quiet, serene, a fortress of upper-middle-class tranquility. I stood in the weeds, the burrs sticking to my jeans, and stared at her patio, my heart hammered against my ribs. "It's a tough sell," Miller said, coming up behind me, breathing heavily from the short walk. The HOA fought the county for years to try and absorb this parcel so they could build a community park. County told them to kick rocks, so the HOA built their big, expensive fence to keep the ugly out. You can't build anything commercial here without rezoning, and the neighborhood will fight you tooth and nail on that. "I don't want to build anything commercial," I said, my eyes still fixed on Veronica's pergola. "What are the restrictions on agricultural use?" Miller scratched his neck. "County limits? Hardly any. It's an old rural township designation. You can't run a slaughterhouse. You can't harbor exotic apex predators. Other than that, it's dirt. The Right to Farm Act protects pretty much everything else." "I'll take it," I said. I didn't blink. I didn't hesitate. I spent the next 5 days drowning in paperwork. I took a massive penalty for pulling from my retirement account early. I transferred the funds. I signed the deed. On a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the HOA meeting where Veronica told me to fill in my pool, I walked into the county clerk's office and received the stamped, finalized deed to the property. I drove straight to the lot. I didn't park on the highway this time. I'd stopped at a hardware store and bought a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. I snipped the rusty padlock off the old agricultural gate by the road, swung it open, and drove my truck right onto the dirt. I parked exactly 3 feet from the wrought iron fence, directly in the sightline of Veronica's outdoor kitchen. I turned off the engine. I rolled down the windows. I sat there in the silence, listening to the ticking of my cooling engine. I looked at the piece of paper in my hand. I owned this dirt. The HOA didn't. Veronica didn't. This was my jurisdiction. I watched as the back door of the brick house swung open. Veronica stepped out onto her travertine patio. She was wearing a floral blouse and holding a glass of iced tea. She froze. She stared at the dusty 10-year-old pickup truck parked in the weeds, marring her perfect view. Even from 30 feet away, I could see the rigid tension in her posture. She set her glass down on an outdoor table and marched toward the iron fence. I didn't get out of the truck. I just smiled, put it in reverse, and drove back onto the highway. The war had moved to a new front. The beauty of the Right to Farm Act is that it was written to protect generational farmers from wealthy city folks who moved to the country and then complained about the smell of cow manure. It is a robust, heavily fortified piece of legislation. I spent 3 consecutive nights reading county ordinances until my eyes bled. I learned about noise curfew exemptions for agricultural machinery. I learned about light pollution statutes, or rather the lack thereof for rural properties requiring security and operational illumination. Most importantly, I learned about compost. Commercial composting is heavily regulated. Agricultural composting for personal use, it's basically a free-for-all. On Thursday morning, I took the day off work. I rented a skid steer. I drove it onto my land and spent 4 hours tearing up the weeds, leveling a massive 50 by 50 foot square directly against the wrought iron fence. The rumble of the diesel engine shook the ground. By noon, Veronica's husband, a tall, pale man who looked perpetually terrified, came out to the patio. He yelled something, waving his arms. I couldn't hear him over the skid steer. I just gave him a friendly wave and kept grading the dirt. At 2:04 p.m., the first delivery arrived. I had contracted with a local dairy farm. They had an excess of raw, unaged cow manure. Usually they pay to have it hauled away. I offered to take it for free. The dump truck backed onto my lot, the reverse alarm beeping loudly. It pulled right up to the freshly leveled dirt pad, 10 feet from the property line, lifted its hydraulic bed, and dumped 6 tons of steaming, putrid manure onto the ground. The smell hit the air like a physical blow. It was dense, acrid. It smelled of ammonia, rot, and raw earth. The wind, mercifully blowing westward, picked up the scent and carried it straight through the iron bars, sweeping over the travertine patio and rushing into the open windows of the brick McMansion. Before the dump truck even made it back to the highway, Veronica was at the fence. She wasn't holding a tablet this time. She was clutching a cell phone to her ear, a medical-grade paper mask strapped over her face. Her eyes were wide, furious, and watering from the ammonia. I climbed out of the skid steer, grabbed a shovel, and walked toward the mountain of feces. "What are you doing?" Veronica shrieked. Her voice was muffled by the mask, but the hysteria cut right through. "You can't dump biological waste here. This is a residential boundary." I leaned on my shovel. I looked at her standing there in her perfect yard, trapped behind her perfect fence. "Afternoon, Veronica," I said cheerfully. "It's not biological waste, it's fertilizer. I'm starting a hobby farm, going to grow some heirloom tomatoes, maybe some squash." "You are violating a dozen community health standards," she yelled, ignoring my greeting. "I'm calling the police. I'm calling the EPA. You will be fined out of existence." "You can call whoever you want, Veronica," I replied, my voice calm, mirroring the exact tone she had used on me a week prior. "Tom, but you're a bit out of your jurisdiction. The HOA stops at the iron." "This is a nuisance," she screamed. "You are deliberately harassing a neighborhood." "I'm engaging in constitutionally protected agricultural activities on appropriately zoned land," I recited, having memorized the statute verbatim. "The setback requirement for a non-commercial compost pile in this county is 5 feet from the property line. I'm a 10. I measured it with a tape. I tapped the shovel against my boot. "Oh, and Veronica," I added, "you have 14 days to submit your apologies for trespassing on my peace of mind. After that, the second manure truck arrives." I turned my back on her and started shoveling. The police arrived an hour later. 2 officers walked up to one on the fence line from Veronica's side. They held their collars over their noses. Veronica stood behind them, arms crossed, looking triumphant. I walked over to the fence, pulled the property deed and the county zoning map from my back pocket, and handed them through the bars. The older officer reviewed the paperwork. He looked at the manure. He looked at me. Then a slow, understanding smirk spread across his face. "Ma'am," the officer said, turning to Veronica. "He owns the lot. It's zoned agricultural. There's no noise ordinance violation during daylight hours, and the Right to Farm Act protects the use of organic fertilizer." "It's a biohazard," Veronica protested, her voice cracking. "He's retaliating against the HOA. Look at him, he's not a farmer." "Intent doesn't dictate zoning laws, ma'am," the officer replied smoothly, handing my papers back through the fence. "Unless he starts dumping it on your side of the property line, there's nothing we can do. Ma, it's a civil matter." They left. Veronica stood at the fence, her hands gripping the black iron bars so hard her knuckles were entirely white. I didn't say a word. I just went back to the skid steer and started moving the pile, making sure it was spread evenly, maximizing the surface area exposed to the afternoon sun. That night, I didn't sleep in my house on Larkspur Lane. I set up a canvas cot in the bed of my truck, parked right next to the compost pile. I bought a set of 4 industrial 10,000 lumen LED work lights. I mounted them on temporary tripods, angled them directly at my compost pile, and plugged them into a portable generator. The light spilled over the property line, illuminating Veronica's backyard like a football stadium. The generator hummed, a loud, grating, mechanical roar. I lay in the bed of my truck, staring up at the few stars visible through the glare of the LEDs. It smelled terrible. The noise was deafening, but as I closed my eyes, I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. The next morning, I bought the donkeys. I named them Barnaby and Clyde. They were miniature Mediterranean donkeys, purchased for $400 apiece from a petting zoo on the verge of bankruptcy, 2 counties over. They had coarse, dusty gray coats, oversized ears, and a deep, existential hatred for anything that moved. Livestock regulations in this particular agricultural zone were delightfully vague. You couldn't keep cattle on less than 5 acres, but miniature equines. The county classified them as companion animals for tax purposes, while the state maintained their agricultural status. It was a beautiful legal loophole. I loaded them into a rented horse trailer and dropped them onto the dirt lot on a Friday evening. If you have never heard a donkey bray, you cannot adequately prepare yourself for the sound. It is not a gentle whinny. It is a violent, guttural, asthmatic wheeze that builds in the creature's chest before exploding into a raspy, metallic scream. It sounds like a rusted gate being torn off its hinges by a freight train. Barnaby and Clyde were highly vocal. They brayed when they were hungry. They brayed when they were full. They brayed when the wind blew. Most importantly, they brayed whenever my industrial LED work lights kicked on at dusk. By Sunday morning, the psychological toll on the cul-de-sac was visible. I was sitting on an overturned plastic bucket near the compost pile, drinking black coffee out of a thermos. I hadn't shaved in a week. I smelled permanently of diesel fuel, damp earth, and cow manure. My back ached from sleeping in the truck bed. I was miserable, but it was a righteous, weaponized misery. Through the iron fence, I saw Veronica's husband, Greg. He was standing on the travertine patio, wearing a silk bathrobe and holding a newspaper he wasn't reading. He looked hollowed out. He had dark circles under his eyes, and his shoulders were slumped in a posture of utter defeat. He walked slowly toward the fence line. I didn't get up. I just watched him approach. "Tristan," Greg said. His voice was quiet, lacking any of the venom his wife possessed. "Morning, Greg. Nice day for farming." Greg gripped the iron bars. He didn't look at the manure pile or the donkeys chewing on a bale of hay a few yards away. He just looked at my boots. "She hasn't slept in 3 days, Tristan," Greg said, his voice trembling slightly. "The lights, the noise, the smell. It's in the curtains. It's in the furniture. We can't even open the windows. We had a dinner party scheduled for last night. We had to cancel it. The caterers wouldn't even walk the food from the driveway to the back door." "That's a shame," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "I was planning on running the wood chipper last night. Could have provided some background music." Greg looked up. There was no anger in his eyes, just exhaustion. He was a man caught in the blast radius of a war he hadn't started. She went too far with the pool, he whispered, glancing back at his own house to make sure Veronica wasn't watching. I told her to leave it alone. I told her the concrete didn't matter. But she can't let things go. She has to be in control. She's talking to lawyers now, Tristan, expensive lawyers. She wants to sue you for intentional infliction of emotional distress. She's trying to find a judge who will grant an emergency injunction to seize the land. Let her try, I said, my voice hardening. This is a right to farm state. My deed is clear. My zoning is clear. Tell her lawyer to look up Hancock was the township of Oak Haven. State Supreme Court set the precedent 12 years ago. Nuisance claims cannot override established agricultural zoning, even if the agricultural use is relatively new. Greg stared at me. You memorized case law? I had a lot of time to read between hauling dirt and buying feed, I replied. I stood up, tossing the dregs of my coffee onto the dry ground. I don't want to ruin your life, Greg, honestly, but Veronica demanded I destroy my property over 4 inches of concrete. She fined me into the ground. She threatened my home. She built her power by making everyone else feel small. Now she gets to feel small. Greg didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, a grim resignation settling over his features. He turned and walked back to his immaculate, unlivable house. The legal letters started arriving on Tuesday. They were delivered by courier to my house on Larkspur Lane. Thick, heavy envelopes filled with aggressive legal jargon, cease and desist orders, and threats of litigation. I didn't read them. I used them as kindling for the small burn barrel I had set up on the lot to dispose of brush and fallen branches. Smoke, as it turns out, is also legally protected under agricultural burning statutes. But the neighborhood was reaching a breaking point. The wind shifted on Thursday. Instead of blowing west toward Veronica's house, it blew north. The scent of 6 tons of raw dairy manure swept over the oak trees and settled directly onto Larkspur Lane. That evening, I was feeding Barnaby some carrots when Dave, my next-door neighbor, pulled his truck up to the agricultural gate. He climbed out and leaned against the wire fencing. He was holding a cardboard 6-pack of cheap domestic beer. You're a madman, Tristan, Dave said, shaking his head. A certified absolute lunatic. I walked over to the gate. I'm assuming the smell reached your porch. It reached my living room, buddy, Dave said, handing a cold bottle over the fence. I took it, twisted off the cap, and drank half of it in one swallow. It was the best thing I had tasted in a week. I'm sorry, Dave. Really, I didn't mean for collateral damage. Don't apologize to me, Dave laughed, a harsh barking sound. You should see the community Facebook page. It's a war zone. But here's the funny part, Tristan. They aren't mad at you. I paused, wiping the condensation from the bottle. What do you mean? Everyone knows why you bought this dirt. The whole subdivision knows about the pool, the setbacks, the fines, Dave explained. Veronica pushed you into a corner, and instead of rolling over, you bought a farm and dropped it on her head. The neighbors aren't mad at the farmer, Tristan. They're furious at the woman who poked the bear. They're calling for her resignation. The HOA inbox is flooded. Nobody cares about your pool anymore. They just want the donkeys to stop screaming. Dave finished his beer, tossed the empty bottle into the bed of his truck, and pointed a finger at me. You hold the line, Dave said softly. You hold it until she breaks, for all of us. I watched Dave drive away. The gray static in my mind was entirely silent now. I wasn't just fighting for my pool anymore. I was dismantling an empire. The 60-day deadline to remove my pool decking arrived on a Tuesday. Coincidentally, it was the exact same day as the monthly HOA board meeting. I didn't wear a suit. I didn't shower. I left my work boots on, the treads caked with dried mud and traces of manure. I put on a clean flannel shirt, grabbed a manila folder, and walked the 3 blocks from my house to the community center. The parking lot was entirely full. Cars were parked on the grass. When I pushed through the double glass doors, a wall of heat and noise hit me. There were at least 100 people crammed into the cinderblock room. The folding chairs were all taken, and residents lined the walls, standing shoulder to shoulder. The low murmur of angry conversation buzzed under the aggressive hum of the fluorescent lights. As I walked down the center aisle, the crowd parted. The murmurs died down, replaced by a tense, electric silence. They smelled the farm on me. They knew who I was. I stopped at the front row. Veronica was sitting behind the plastic folding table. The transformation was startling. Her rigid, motionless helmet of blonde hair was flat and slightly frizzy. The expensive gray blazer looked rumpled. The pale blue eyes that had stared right through me 2 months ago were now bloodshot, darting nervously around the crowded room. The man in the suit was gone. The elderly woman knitting the scarf refused to look up. Veronica was alone on her throne. She banged the wooden gavel. It sounded weak. "This emergency meeting of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association is called to order," Veronica said. Her voice cracked on the last word. She cleared her throat and tried again. "We are here to discuss a special assessment. The board requires emergency legal funding to pursue litigation against a hostile entity operating on the neighborhood's western boundary." The room erupted. "You want us to pay for your lawsuit?" a man in the back yelled. "You started this, Veronica," a woman shouted from the left wall. "You tried to steal his pool over 4 inches of concrete. Now my kids can't play outside because it smells like a landfill." "Resign," someone else chanted. Veronica slammed the gavel down repeatedly. "Order, I demand order. The charter explicitly states that we must defend the community standards. He is violating the sanctity of this neighborhood. He's operating a legal agricultural entity," Dave yelled from the second row, reading directly from a piece of paper he had printed out. "And your vendetta is destroying our property values." I stepped forward. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The moment I moved toward the table, the room went dead silent again. Everyone wanted to see the executioner get led to the block. I placed my manila folder on the plastic table. I slid it exactly to the center, right over the HOA seal printed on the tablecloth. "No one needs to sue anyone, Veronica," I said, my voice carrying cleanly across the quiet room. "I brought a settlement offer." Veronica stared at the folder like it was a live grenade. "I do not negotiate with terrorists." A collective groan rolled through the room. Even the elderly knitting woman rolled her eyes. "I'm not a terrorist, I'm a farmer," I corrected her gently. "And this is a contract drafted by a real estate attorney. It's very simple." I opened the folder and turned the document around so she could read it. "Item 1, I announced, loud enough for the back row to hear. "The Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association grants a permanent, legally binding variance to the property at 42 Larkspur Lane, allowing the concrete pool decking to remain in perpetuity. This variance will be recorded with the county clerk and attached to the deed." Veronica clenched her jaw. "You are violating the drainage easement." "The county engineer signed off on my drainage flow yesterday," I countered smoothly. "The water routes around the concrete perfectly. It's a non-issue, but let's get to the good part." I tapped the second page of the contract. "Item 2. In exchange for this permanent variance, I will sell the 2.5-acre agricultural lot to the Homeowners Association for exactly $45,000, the exact price I paid. I make no profit. I will remove the lights. I will rehome Barnaby and Clyde, and I will pay a crew to haul away the compost." The crowd murmured approvingly. It was an exit strategy, a way out of the madness. "And item 3, I said, leaning over the table, bringing my face close to hers. "You step down as president, effective immediately. You surrender your position on the board, and you never run for a committee seat again." Veronica's breath hitched. She looked at the contract. She looked at the angry mob of neighbors behind me. She was cornered. Her power, built on intimidation and pedantic rule following, had entirely evaporated in the face of sheer, unrelenting chaos. She had expected me to fight back with emails and polite requests. She hadn't expected me to buy the dirt beneath her pedestal and turn it into a swamp. "You can't force me to resign," she hissed, a desperate final defense. "I can't," I agreed. "But if you don't sign that contract tonight, I decline the sale of the land. I keep the lot, and tomorrow morning I am taking delivery of 4 breeding roosters. Do you know what time roosters start crowing, Veronica? Because it's a lot earlier than you think." Veronica closed her eyes. Her hand shook as she reached for a pen. She signed the first page. She signed the second. She didn't say a word as she pushed the folder back across the table. She stood up, grabbed her heavy leather binder, and walked away from the table. She didn't look at the crowd. She just walked out the side door into the night. The room erupted into applause. Someone clapped me on the back. Dave handed me another cheap beer, completely disregarding the ban on alcohol in the community center. I didn't stay for the celebration. The new acting board president, the man in the suit, hurriedly countersigned the variance and stamped it with the official seal. I took my copies, folded them into my pocket, and walked home. I went straight to my backyard. The night was quiet. The wind was still. I walked over to the pool equipment and flicked a switch. The variable speed pump hummed to life. It was a low, steady thrum, a mechanical heartbeat. I stripped off my boots, my dirty flannel, and my jeans. I stood on the edge of the coping looking down at the crystal clear water glowing faint blue in the dark. I didn't look at the fence. I didn't look at the bushes. I just stepped forward and let the water take me. The cold shock washed away the dirt, the smell of diesel, and the lingering gray static. I surfaced, floating on my back, looking up at the stars. It was perfectly silent. And for the first time in 10 years, I was truly home. If you thought dealing with a tyrant in a tennis skirt was impossible, let this be your blueprint. Sometimes you can't fight bureaucracy with logic. You have to fight it with a few tons of manure and a couple of very loud donkeys. If Tristan's absolute refusal to back down gave you a second-hand thrill, or if you've ever wanted to stick it to an overstepping HOA, hit that like button right now. Share this video with anyone who needs a masterclass in petty revenge, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of people taking their peace back by force.